Imagine for a second, um, you were just walking down your street, and you see your neighbor standing out there in their driveway.
Okay, I am picturing it.
Yeah, and they have, a bucket of soapy water, a big sponge, and they were just meticulously washing and waxing the outside of their car.
Right, just a normal Saturday chore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're scrubbing the rims, polishing the door handles, making sure there is not a single water spot on the paint. They look totally dedicated to taking care of this vehicle.
So far, they sound like a pretty good neighbor to have.
Well, yeah, but here's the massive problem. While they're scrubbing the exterior, the hood is popped open and the engine block is actively on fire.
Oh, wow. Okay, that took a turn.
Right. Flames are shooting out, black smoke is just billowing into the sky, and total destruction is happening under the hood, yet they just keep polishing the side mirrors.
That is a really terrifying image because the disproportion of their focus is just so extreme.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, they are obsessed with making the outside look flawless to anyone walking by while completely ignoring the catastrophic reality that the whole core of the vehicle is burning to the ground.
That terrifying disproportion is, well, it is the very subject we are unpacking today. Welcome to Reform Thinking.
It is great to be here for this one.
Today, we are bringing you a really intensive look into a specific passage of Scripture. We are doing a deep dive into Matthew chapter 23, verses 23 and 24.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
It really is. This is a moment where Jesus delivers just a blistering, absolute critique of religious hypocrisy.
And, the sources we're looking at today provide two really comprehensive theological expositions on this very specific text.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the devastating warning against what we can call micro-legalism.
Micro-legalism, I like that term.
Yeah, it is this human tendency to obsess over microscopic outward rules while completely abandoning the heavy inward virtues of God's law.
Which brings us right back to your car analogy. It is all about presenting a flawless exterior while the engine is actively on fire.
So, to grasp the full weight of this ancient critique, we first have to, step into the tense, politically charged streets of first-century Jerusalem.
Yeah, the historical setting here is absolutely critical. We are in the final week of Jesus's earthly ministry.
Right. The clock is ticking down to the crucifixion.
Exactly. The tension in the city is just palpable. He has made his triumphal entry, he has cleansed the temple, and now he's engaged in this escalating series of public clashes.
And he's clashing specifically with the religious establishment, right?
Yes, the text is operating within the dispensation of the law. Jesus is offering the Davidic kingdom to the nation of Israel, but the apostate leaders are actively rejecting him.
And this specific confrontation is really the climax of that rejection, isn't it?
It is. The targets of this specific rebuke are the scribes, who were the experts in the law, and the Pharisees.
Let us put some dirt under our feet here and understand who he is talking to, because people today throw the word Pharisee around as just a generic insult,
Oh, yeah, definitely. Anyone who is a bit too strict or judgmental gets called a Pharisee.
Right. But we really need to look at their actual history. They get a bad rap today. But didn't they start out as the good guys?
They absolutely did. They started with a very noble motivation. And honestly, understanding that motivation makes their eventual downfall so much more tragic.
So if we go back a few hundred years before this confrontation, what were they actually trying to accomplish?
Well, you have to trace their origins all the way back to the Babylonian exile.
Okay, so the destruction of the first temple.
Right. The Jewish people lost their land, their temple was destroyed, and they were carried off into captivity. And they had to ask themselves why that happened.
And the prophets made the answer to that pretty clear, right?
Exactly. It happened because the nation failed to keep God's law. They had fallen into idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness.
So the exile was a massive traumatic judgment.
A huge trauma. So when the exiles finally returned, and then later during the Maccabean revolt, when Greek culture was really trying to assimilate them, there was this intense burning desire among the faithful to preserve the nation.
They thought, we can never let another exile happen.
Precisely. They decided they must protect the law at all costs.
That makes total sense from a psychological perspective. I mean, if you burn your hand on a hot stove, you do not just avoid the burner, you avoid the whole kitchen.
That is a great way to put it. And that trauma response is what led them to develop this concept of building a fence around the law.
A fence around the law. Let us break that down for the listener. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, the logic of the fence is pretty simple. If God's law says, do not work on the Sabbath, the Pharisees would come along and say, well, let us define what work is down to the smallest possible detail.
So they start adding their own rules to clarify God's rule.
Right. They would make a rule that you cannot tie a specific kind of knot on the Sabbath, or you cannot carry an object heavier than a dried fig.
A dried fig. That is incredibly specific.
It is. But the idea was that if you keep all these extra stricter man-made rules on the outside, if you never even touch the fence, you will never come close to breaking God's actual command in the center.
Okay, I see the logic. But the text we are studying today shows how that desire for purity morphed into something just completely absurd, particularly when it came to tithing.
Yes, tithing is the specific issue Jesus targets here. Now, the Mosaic Law, in places like Leviticus 27 and Deuteronomy 14, commanded a tenth of the land's seed, fruit, and grain.
And that was to support the priesthood and the needy, right?
Yes, it was a clear, manageable agricultural tax, essentially. But the rabbinic tradition, which was later codified in the Mishnah, specifically a tractate called Masrot, expanded this command.
And when you say expanded, you mean they took it to a microscopic degree.
Oh, absolutely. The text zeroes in on the tithing of mint, dill, and cumin.
So we are talking about tiny little garden herbs now.
Right. These were common, inexpensive plants grown in tiny household garden patches. People just used them for flavoring food or for basic medicine.
They were not major cash crops like wheat or olives, which the law was originally focused on.
No, not at all. But the Pharisees applied the law of tithing so rigorously that they would actually sit down and count or weigh these tiny seeds and leaves.
Wait, really? They would count individual seeds?
Yes. If they harvested 10 tiny dill seeds from their windowsill, they would painstakingly set one aside for God. They believed this extreme scrupulousness merited divine favor.
Let us think about the psychology of that for a minute.
Go for it.
If I sit in my kitchen counting out individual cumin seeds, I am doing something that is entirely within my control.
Right. It is a completely closed system.
Exactly. I can count it, I can put it in a ledger, and I can visibly demonstrate how pious I am. If someone visits my house, they see my little separated pile of holy cumin seeds.
It is very tangible proof of your religion.
But here's the catch. Counting seeds requires zero death to self. It asks absolutely nothing of my heart.
That is the devastating part. You can be a greedy, arrogant, bitter person while counting your seeds perfectly.
Right. It is a highly measurable, performative religion that conceals total spiritual bankruptcy.
That is the insidious nature of this micro-legalism. It allows a person to feel intensely holy based on easily manageable external metrics.
You can manage your mint leaves without ever having to confront the pride or the bitterness festering inside your own soul.
And it creates a self-contained system of self-justification. The tragedy here is that this system completely blinded the leaders of Israel to their true condition.
I mean, they were standing face to face with the Messiah, the fulfillment of all their hopes, yet they were so enamored with their own rule-keeping that they viewed him as a threat. So the historical progression goes from a sincere desire to protect the covenant community all the way to a massive superiority complex.
Yes, a superiority complex that eventually orchestrates the crucifixion of the Son of God.
That really shatters the assumption a lot of people have today. You know, the idea that if you just get stricter and stricter with your rules, you automatically get closer to God.
Right. It proves that historical progression did not equal spiritual progression. The most conservative, literalist sect of Judaism became the architects of the crucifixion.
It is a really sobering reality. Our sources argue that conservative, rule-following religion that lacks the Holy Spirit is as damning as outright paganism.
I would agree with that assessment. You can go to hell from the pew just as easily as you can from the street corner.
Perhaps even more easily, because the person in the pew thinks their ledger is balanced.
Yeah, exactly. They have their 10th dill seeds separated, so they assume God owes them his favor. They don't think they need a savior.
That historical powder keg is precisely why the way the gospel writer structured this story hits so incredibly hard.
Matthew didn't just throw this interaction in randomly.
No, this wasn't a casual debate that Jesus had while walking between towns. It reads like a carefully crafted legal argument.
It does. If we look at the literary context, the placement of this discourse is staggering.
Let's unpack that literary placement. Where does this fall in the book of Matthew?
It is central to understanding the impact. In chapter 23, Jesus is delivering his final public discourse before leaving the Temple Mount for the last time.
So these are his final public words.
Yes. After this, he goes to the Mount of Olives and delivers the Olivet Discourse, which outlines the coming tribulation and judgment on Jerusalem.
So chapter 23 is really his closing argument to the nation.
It is. He is functioning in the office of the prophet, much like Moses. This entire chapter operates as the ultimate covenant lawsuit.
A covenant lawsuit, meaning he is officially pressing charges on behalf of God.
Right. He is bringing the gavel of divine justice down upon the heads of the men who have scattered and abused God's flock.
The sources we were reviewing frame Matthew chapter 23 as the dark mirror to the Sermon on the Mount, which is found earlier in Matthew chapters 5 through 7.
That is a great way to look at it, a dark mirror.
Yeah, because in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives the Beatitudes. He pronounces divine blessings on the poor in spirit, the merciful, the pure in heart.
But here, at the end of his ministry, we get the dark reflection. We get the 7 woes. He pronounces divine curses upon the proud, the unmerciful, and the defiled.
We should probably define what a woe is in biblical literature.
We definitely should. When we use the word today, it sounds like a mild complaint, like, oh, woe is me, I dropped my coffee.
Right, it sounds a bit melodramatic.
But in the Greek text and in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah, a woe is a very serious thing. It is an eschatological curse.
Meaning a curse related to final judgment.
Yes. It is an interjection of divine wrath. When Jesus says, woe to you, he is speaking as the authoritative judge of the covenant community.
He is declaring a prophetic sentence of impending doom. It is an announcement that time is officially up.
The structure within this chapter is brilliant, too. He delivers 7 of these woes in total.
And the first 3, which are found in verses 13 through 22, they condemn external public actions, right?
Right. He calls them out for shutting the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for devouring widows' houses, and for making false proselytes.
So these are highly visible crimes, things everyone could see them doing.
Exactly. But then we hit the 4th woe in verses 23 and 24, which is our text today. And the literary flow pivots very sharply.
That pivot changes the entire nature of the attack.
It really does. He transitions from exposing the damage they do to other people in public to exposing the cold, calculating internal corruption of their own personal obedience in private.
So the first 3 woes expose their destructive influence, but the 4th woe exposes the disproportion of their personal piety.
Right. They look meticulous, but the structure forces the audience to see that their meticulousness is a complete facade.
It makes me think of a highly skilled prosecutor delivering a closing argument to a jury.
Oh, that is a good comparison.
Yeah, the prosecutor starts by listing the visible damages and the tangible crimes the jury can easily see. You know, the fraud, the theft, the victims whose lives were ruined.
And the jury is nodding along, agreeing that the defendant is a menace to society.
Exactly. But then the prosecutor dramatically pivots. They walk over to the defendant, look them dead in the eye, and expose the cold, rotting, calculating motives inside the defendant's mind that made those crimes possible in the first place.
The argument moves from the scene of the crime to the psychology of the criminal.
That analogy tracks perfectly with the rhetorical strategy Jesus employs here.
And to appreciate the specific charges in this covenant lawsuit, we really have to analyze the precise words the prosecutor chose to use.
The authors of the text we are studying conduct a rigorous exegetical breakdown of the Greek structure, and it is highly illuminating.
Let us examine that exegesis. The text sets up a very sharp contrast. We have a minor obedience clause right next to a major disobedience clause.
Right. Jesus says, "For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law."
The verbs painted in the original language give a very clear picture of their behavior. The verb used for tithing is apodekatu.
Apodekatu. What did that literally mean?
It means to give an exact tenth. It denotes active, careful, intentional calculation.
So they're actively, intentionally tithing the insignificant garden plants.
Yes. But then comes the contrast with the verb aphinemi. This is translated as neglected or forsaken.
And what does that imply?
It signifies leaving aside, disregarding, or failing to attend to. It is an active omission.
So they didn't just forget about the major matters because they were busy counting seeds?
No, they actively calculated the mint, and they actively chose to forsake the monumental demands of God's character.
And Jesus defines those monumental demands as the weightier matters of the law. The Greek phrase is tabaritera tu nomou.
Tabaritera tu nomou. The adjective baris means heavy, burdensome, or carrying great ethical gravity.
In rabbinic literature of that era, laws were often divided into light and heavy commands, weren't they?
Yes, they were. So Jesus is actually taking their own theological categories and turning them completely upside down.
He is essentially saying, you claim to be the experts on the heavy commands, but you have abandoned them entirely.
That is a brutal indictment.
So what are the three weightier matters he specifically lists?
The three matters are justice, mercy, and faithfulness. We should look at each one carefully, starting with justice.
Okay, justice. The Greek word here is crisis, right?
Yes, crisis. In the Greco-Roman world, this pertained to legal judgment in a courtroom. But Jesus is speaking out of the biblical context, tracing back to the Hebrew word mishpat.
Mishpat. That is a massive concept in the Old Testament.
It is. It refers to righteous judgment, fairness, and upholding the rights of the oppressed according to God's standard.
So it means dealing rightly and truthfully with others, refusing partiality, refusing to take bribes, and refusing deceit.
Exactly. It is an objective standard of right and wrong based on the character of God himself.
You know, the authors we were studying make a very sharp critique here regarding how the concept of justice is handled today.
They do go into some modern applications of this.
Yeah, they argue against modern secular redefinitions of justice.
Yeah.
They specifically call out critical race theory and intersectionality.
Right, and we should be clear that we are just reporting the critique made by the authors of the source text here. We are not taking a side, just explaining their position.
Of course. The perspective presented in this research suggests that modern political frameworks define justice based on oppressor versus oppressed group dynamics.
And the authors contend that this is a distortion of the biblical text.
Right. They argue that biblical crisis is not based on sociology or modern political theory, but is rooted entirely in the unchanging holiness of God.
They emphasize impartial fairness toward every individual, regardless of their status or group identity.
So that covers justice. Moving to the second weighty matter, we have mercy.
Yes, mercy. The Greek word is eleos. This translates the magnificent Old Testament Hebrew word hesed.
Hesed is one of those words that is so hard to translate into English because it carries so much meaning.
It really is. It means loving kindness, covenant loyalty, and compassionate grace toward the miserable.
It requires a tender, compassionate response to the weak, the needy, and the guilty. It reflects God's own pity toward sinners.
And the Pharisees were notorious for being harsh, unyielding, and demanding.
They lacked the very compassion that characterized the God they claimed to worship.
They would watch someone suffer and assume it was God's judgment on that person, rather than seeing an opportunity to show hesed.
It is a cold way to live. And the third matter is faithfulness.
Right. Faithfulness. The Greek word is pistis. We usually translate that simply as faith or belief in the New Testament.
But in this specific context, sandwiched alongside justice and mercy, it carries a different nuance, doesn't it?
Yes, it carries the nuance of the Old Testament Hebrew word emunah.
Emunah, what does that convey?
It speaks of steadfastness, reliability, integrity, and fidelity to both God and man.
It is about keeping your promises even when it hurts.
Absolutely. If you look at Old Testament prophets, like Micah chapter 6, verse 8, you see a very similar triad.
Oh, right. To do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God.
Exactly. Jesus is echoing the prophets here. He is pointing out that these virtues are not secondary concerns. They are the central obligations of the covenant.
Because they reveal what God himself is actually like.
Spot on. Now, if we look at this from a practical standpoint, I can see a listener pushing back on this entire concept.
Pushing back how?
Because when Jesus comes down so incredibly hard on the Pharisees for obsessing over the tithing of herbs, people often use passages like this to excuse ignoring the finer details of their own faith.
Oh, I see what you mean. You will hear someone say, look, God only cares about my heart.
Right. They say, he only cares that I am a good person and that I love people. He does not care about specific rules or theology or church attendance or moral guidelines.
They say sweating those details is just straining gnats. Are they reading the text correctly when they make that argument?
They are completely misreading the text if they draw that conclusion. We have to look at the divine command clause right in the middle of the verse.
What does that clause say?
Jesus says, these you ought to have done without neglecting the others.
Okay, so he addresses both sides.
Yes. In the Greek syntax, he uses an imperfect verb, eide, which indicates an absolute binding moral obligation.
He uses a chiasm of priority, right? These, referring to the heavy matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness, must absolutely be done.
Yes, but the others, referring to the minor details like the tithing of herbs, must not be neglected.
So he is not swinging the pendulum wildly from strict legalism over to complete lawlessness.
Not at all. We are not just supposed to throw the rule book out the window because we are focusing on quote-unquote love.
Jesus demands comprehensive obedience.
He affirms the necessity of both the major and the minor commands, but he insists on proper proportion.
The error of the Pharisees was not that they were careful about small things.
No, their error was a distorted spirituality that elevated the small while excusing the total neglect of the great.
True obedience flows from the inside out. When a person's heart is governed by genuine justice, mercy, and faithfulness, that inner reality will naturally produce careful obedience in the smaller details of life.
You do not abandon the details. You put them in their proper place in the hierarchy of obedience.
That distinction protects against dead legalism on one side and spiritual laziness on the other. It is a brilliant calibration.
It is. And after laying out this dense, devastating legal and linguistic argument, Jesus knows he needs an image that the crowd will never forget.
He needs a visual that will stick in their minds long after they leave the Temple Mount.
And he delivers one of the most memorable, almost comical punchlines in all of Scripture.
He says in verse 24, "You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel."
That is the climactic summary of the entire woe.
The authors of our text explain that this is actually a brilliant Aramaic wordplay.
Yes, Jesus most likely spoke Aramaic to these crowds in daily life.
And the Aramaic word for gnat is galma, while the Aramaic word for camel is gumel.
It is a pun, but a pun with massive theological weight. Both of these animals are considered unclean, according to Leviticus chapter 11.
The visual comedy here is really grounded in strict Levitical law.
Leviticus 11 verses 20 through 23 declare winged insects to be unclean, and verse 4 explicitly declares the camel unclean.
And the Pharisees were so terrified of ceremonial defilement that they would painstakingly filter their drinking wine through a piece of cloth or a fine sieve.
They want to ensure they didn't accidentally ingest a tiny galma, a gnat that might have landed in the cup. That is the smallest unclean creature.
But spiritually speaking, Jesus says they're opening their throats and gulping down a massive gamla, the largest unclean animal in their region.
The visual of a distinguished religious leader carefully filtering his wine and then unhinging his jaw to swallow a live camel whole is just grotesque.
It's grotesque and hilarious at the same time. The text points out something fascinating about the grammar here, too.
What is that?
The Greek uses present participles. It says straining out and swallowing.
So this indicates that this wasn't just a one-time mistake they made.
Exactly. It was an ongoing habitual practice. They woke up every day, strained their wine, and swallowed camels. It unveils the utter irrationality of sin.
Hypocrisy trains the human conscience to be terrified of trifles while remaining totally tolerant of enormities.
You become hypersensitive to minor infractions while becoming completely desensitized to massive moral failures.
The Pharisees would panic if a gnat touched their wine, but they felt absolutely no conviction about plotting to murder an innocent man, which is exactly what they were doing with Jesus.
It is like someone decided to take out the household trash, but before they walked to the curb, they put on a full, maximum security biological hazmat suit.
With an oxygen tank and taped up seams.
Right. They're terrified of getting a microscopic germ on them from a discarded wrapper.
But then they come back inside, take off the hazmat suit, and decide to eat completely raw, unwashed chicken for dinner.
Yes. It is a terrifying disproportion of caution. The hazmat suit shows they understand the concept of contamination.
But eating raw chicken proves their survival instincts and their fundamental understanding of reality are completely broken.
That analogy perfectly captures the absurdity of their condition.
And this grotesque disproportion leaves the original audience and, frankly, the modern reader in a state of despair.
Because if you think about it, the Pharisees were the most religiously devout, disciplined, biblically literate people in that society.
If they failed this badly, if their religion was this corrupt at its core, where is the hope for anyone else?
The law demands perfect justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Who can actually produce that?
If they couldn't do it with all their free time and dedicated study, a regular person has no chance.
And that brings us to the most critical turn in this entire discussion. The text exposes a terrifying human inability.
Fallen humans cannot produce the perfect justice, mercy, and faithfulness that the law requires. We simply do not have it in us.
If a sermon ends with just the message, "You guys need to be better at mercy and justice," we are all doomed.
We are just going to try to build a new, slightly different fence.
We have to look at how this text points to the fulfillment of the law.
We do. As Reformed theologians affirm, all scriptures point to the work of Christ. This passage is a negative exposition of the law.
It shows us what the law demands and how badly we fail at it.
But that negative exposition demands a positive Christological fulfillment. Jesus is not just a moral teacher diagnosing a societal problem.
He is the solution to the problem.
He is the only human in history who perfectly fulfilled both the minor details and the major matters of the law.
The authors talk extensively about Christ's active obedience. I want to break down what that term actually means for the person listening right now.
Active obedience refers to Jesus living a life of perfect, flawless submission to God's law on behalf of his people.
So he didn't just come to die, he came to live perfectly first.
Right. He was born under the law, as the book of Galatians states. He kept the feasts. He paid the temple tax. He obeyed every minor statute.
But infinitely more than that, he embodied the weightier matters.
He didn't just perform isolated acts of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He is the very embodiment of those virtues in human flesh.
He is perfectly just in all his judgments. He is endlessly merciful toward the outcast and the broken.
And he is unfailingly faithful in every covenant obligation to his Father.
The breakdown of his roles here is fascinating. We see Christ functioning in three distinct offices simultaneously: prophet, king, and high priest.
Let us start with prophet. As a prophet, he is standing on the Temple Mount exposing the hypocrisy of the false shepherds.
He is declaring the pure truth of God's demands without compromise.
And as a king, he is pronouncing divine, authoritative judgment upon his enemies. The woe is a royal sentence from the throne.
But it is as our great high priest that the gospel shines the brightest in this text.
Think about the cross in relation to these specific weightier matters we just discussed.
Okay, God's justice, his crisis, demands that sin be punished. God cannot simply overlook the rebellion and the camel swallowing of humanity.
To satisfy that massive, unyielding matter of justice, Christ willingly took the curse upon himself. The unmitigated, holy justice of God was poured out upon the Son on the cross.
And because that massive requirement of justice was fully satisfied in this substitute, God is now able to extend the weightier matter of mercy, his eleos, to wretched sinners like us.
The cross is the exact point where God's perfect justice and perfect mercy intersect. He doesn't compromise one to achieve the other.
And Christ's willingness to endure the cross, to go all the way to death, demonstrates ultimate faithfulness, his pistis.
He was faithful to the Father's plan and faithful to save his people.
This theological reality is why the application of this text requires so much precision.
It really does, because if someone listens to this deep dive, hears all this history and exegesis, and walks away thinking, okay, the lesson here is that I just need to try harder.
Right, if they think, I need to be a nicer person, I need to focus less on my daily calendar and more on being just and merciful.
If that is their takeaway, they have entirely missed the point of the text.
I want to stop and push on that. Why is try harder to be nice missing the point? Didn't Jesus literally just command them to do the weightier matters?
He is commanding it, yes. But according to the theological framework we are studying, preaching this text merely as a command to do better is preaching the law, not the gospel.
The law says, do this and live.
But our fallen human nature makes that impossible. We cannot generate true, God-honoring justice and mercy out of the stony ground of our own fallen hearts.
If we try, we will inevitably turn our attempts at mercy into another form of self-righteous performance.
We will just start measuring our mercy the same way the Pharisees measured their mint.
The gospel, however, relies on union with Christ. We must be united to him by faith, so that his perfect righteousness is credited to us.
His flawless record of justice, mercy, and faithfulness is imputed or legally credited to our account.
That shifts the entire paradigm of how we live. Once a person understands they cannot earn salvation through micro-legalism or even through their own flawed attempts at macro-righteousness, their entire motivation changes.
You stop doing good works to earn a paycheck from God, and you start doing them out of gratitude.
This brings us to the modern polemical applications. How do the authors of these texts apply this ancient warning to the current age?
They utilize a concept known in Reformed theology as the third use of the law.
The third use of the law. Explain that briefly.
Well, the law has different uses. It restrains evil in society, and it drives us to Christ by showing us our sin. But the third use is the normative guide for the believer.
Meaning it shows us how to live a life that pleases God.
Yes. We do not pursue justice, mercy, and faithfulness in order to be justified or saved. We pursue them because we have already been freely justified by faith alone.
The Holy Spirit writes the law in our hearts,
Hmm?
empowering us to obey out of a profound gratitude, not out of a terrifying fear of condemnation.
With that foundation of grace established, the text systematically lays out some very sharp critiques against various modern movements.
The authors argue that the spirit of the Pharisees is alive and well, just wearing different clothes.
The first critique is directed at Roman Catholic doctrines.
And again, we are just outlining the arguments made in the source text here.
Correct. The authors argue that adding sacraments, penances, and human traditions as necessary requirements for justification is akin to the Pharisaic edition of the Mishnah.
They argue it mirrors the works righteousness system that Jesus was condemning, substituting outward rituals for absolute reliance on the finished work of Christ.
The authors then pivot and level a critique at theological liberalism and the social gospel movement.
The argument here is that these progressive movements divorce the concepts of justice and mercy from the blood atonement of Christ.
The authors claim that by stripping away the supernatural elements, the wrath of God and the necessity of the cross, these movements turn the Christian faith into a secular political action committee.
They want the weightier matters of the law. They want social justice and mercy for the poor.
But they want them without submitting to the Lord of the law or acknowledging the depths of human sin that made the cross necessary.
Next, the text turns its critique toward pragmatic, seeker-sensitive modern evangelicalism. This is a very common target.
It is. The authors argue that these church models focus almost entirely on outward, manageable metrics.
Things like weekly attendance numbers, the square footage of the building, the production value of the music, and social media engagement.
They compare this obsession with data to the Pharisees counting mint leaves.
The critique is that by focusing on these highly visible, easily manipulated metrics, pragmatic leaders ignore the heavy, difficult, unpopular preaching of sin, God's wrath, and the need for deep repentance.
The authors suggest these leaders strain the gnat of potentially offending a first-time visitor with hard truth, but they gladly swallow the camel of generating thousands of false conversions by preaching a watered-down message.
Finally, the text offers a critique regarding charismatic movements, specifically from a cessationist perspective.
The argument presented is that an intense, constant pursuit of spectacular apostolic-era signs, wonders, and emotional experiences can actually distract people.
Distract them from the weightier matters of daily obedience.
The authors contend that the true, lasting evidence of the Spirit's work is not found in spectacular public displays, but in a quiet, steady, often boring life marked by consistent justice, mercy, and faithfulness.
When you look at all these critiques laid out together, the traditionalists, the liberals, the pragmatists, the charismatics, you start to see a universal human problem rising to the surface.
That is exactly what I was thinking as I read through those arguments.
I see a fascinating pattern. Aren't all these different modern factions guilty of the exact same underlying psychological trick?
What do you mean?
Aren't they all just finding different ways to prefer a manageable, measurable religion over actual, painful inward transformation?
The authors would strongly agree with that assessment. The central idea of this biblical text is that fallen humans will use any metric available to them to establish superiority over others,
and to mask their own internal rebellion against God.
whether you are using theological exactitude, attendance numbers, social activism credentials, or ecstatic spiritual experiences.
If you use those things to avoid the humbling, crushing demands of God's moral law regarding how you treat your neighbor and how you view your own sin, you are playing the Pharisee.
You are out in the driveway polishing the outside of the car while the engine block burns to ashes.
The warning is universal, and it is completely unavoidable. It forces every single one of us to look in the mirror, not just at other groups.
Which is a tough thing to do.
It is. And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We have talked a lot about ancient history, Greek words, Aramaic puns, and theological frameworks.
But we need to bring this right down to the ground.
Let us bring this right into your living room right now. If Jesus were to audit the literal ledger of your daily life today, what would he find?
And by that we mean he bypasses your own flattering self-perception and looks strictly at the hard data.
Yes, looking strictly at your digital calendar and your bank statements, what would he find?
It is a devastating audit to consider, because our calendars and our bank accounts do not lie about what we truly value.
They are the objective ledgers of our lives. Would he see a meticulous, exhausting counting of mint leaves?
Would he see an obsession with minor daily routines, protecting your own comfort, meticulously managing your retirement portfolio, and carefully curating your outward image on social media?
Or looking at exactly how you spend your time and your money. Would he see the heavy, undeniable footprints of justice, mercy, and faithfulness?
Would he see evidence that you actively care for the vulnerable, that you forgive those who wrong you, and that you are faithful to your promises even when it costs you financially or socially?
That audit reveals whether we are straining gnats and swallowing camels in our own modern context. It strips away the religious language and looks at the functional reality of our faith.
It is a hard question, but a necessary one.
I encourage you to genuinely audit your own routines this week. Look at where your energy actually goes. Look at what makes you angry and what makes you rejoice. See where you might be straining gnats while swallowing camels. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on the Formed Thinking.
We hope this discussion has been helpful.
We will catch you on the next one.